Welcome to What's Left, a weekly political discussion challenging the mainstream left. My name is Andy Libson, and I'm joined by Kenny Zepeda and Alex. And as you can see, no Eduardo today. We are online at what'sleftpodcast.com. You can find the link to our blog in the episode notes. Please subscribe, rate, review, turn on your notifications, share your favorite episode, and jot down our information wherever you found this episode. We're going to be talking about the elections today, but I'm going to turn it over to Alex, who I think, Alex, this was your idea, kind of like wanting to talk about the elections, but not just the U.S. elections in general. So why don't you take it from there?
Yeah. So obviously, I think for those of us who are Americans, and that's all three of us here at this table today, we know that the elections are coming up, whether or not we plan on voting for the president, lower down the ballot, et cetera, et cetera. It's a topic of discussion and something of concern. But I also wanted to look at some of the really significant international elections going on. We've already talked about the Mexican election previously, and I direct anyone that didn't listen to that episode to go listen to it. We had a very lively discussion there. But we were specifically going to look at the English and French election that just passed, and then maybe a little bit at the Iranian election for a bit, mention maybe any other general elections that we want to talk about, and then return to looking forward towards a general discussion about the U.S. election. So let me maybe set the stage for where we're at. Oh, yeah, sure. Go ahead, Ken.
I just wanted to add that this year happens to have a bunch of elections, right? Different than many other years. Russia had their own election, right? India had an election also, right? So then we have these major powers in Europe that we're going to talk about, and then Iran as well. But again, it's a big year, and I guess we'll get into if that means anything, right, for the world, and yeah, we'll get to that. But
Ukraine should have had an election, but they canceled it.
It's a pivot year. A lot. In fact, I maybe want to make a small stop with this point that you've raised, Kenny, because things work cyclically. Calendars were an innovation that humanity had to discover and agree on over time. It sounds like it may be a boring study, but for those of us that do study calendars at all, we do start to understand that there are certain rhythms to the years in which ones kind of hit harder than others. And I think this is certainly a year that's hitting a little harder. There's a lot of pre-planned events that are happening or not happening, as you pointed out, Andy. So regardless of what the result of these events is, going into this year, you had to know, if you were in the know, that there was going to be a lot moving this year. Let's start, I guess, with the UK election, since it's maybe a little bit more familiar, I would think, to most of our American listeners. Obviously, they also speak English, so it's a lot easier for us to take in the primary sources from there. But in the UK, there was a so-called historic Labour victory. But Andy, do you mind bringing up some of those charts that you had mentioned to us? Yeah. And what this looks like, just looking at this, by the way, Andy, it does look like these numbers are only for England, I would guess, because the House of Commons has a lot more seats than this, and there are parties not represented here.
I see.
So, and I don't know, maybe I'm incorrect about that, but just looking at it, the numbers don't quite count up to the total number of UK seats. But anyway, we can see that previous vote shares have been totally surpassed. In fact, you know what? Could you look for just the total vote share?
That thing, right?
Excellent. Okay. And then there's there's a comparison right below it, looks like.
Okay.
All right. So, all right, let me jump back into it.
Yeah.
So here's a look at the overall, and I like this chart because it's a straight up bar chart. It shows just the massive, towering majority that the Labour government has. Right now, Labour commands what's called a true majority. They do not need any other political parties to collaborate with to form a coalition. That's usually the way things are done in multi-party systems, right? Places like Europe, South America, Africa, Asia, etc. It's usually made up of coalitions. There are major parties, but they usually don't have enough of the vote share to make up 50% plus one of their legislature. But in this case, they have far exceeded it. I'm not quite sure if it's an absolute majority. That would be like 75%. I don't think they're quite there. That would be for like serious, basic law changes, but they command a very impressive majority. The conservatives have fallen. If we go down to the place where we can see the change, and these numbers are all from the House of Commons itself, Labor has gained 209 seats, and more than this being an election in support of Labor, this is a repudiation of the conservative government, which has been in power for more than a decade. We can see that they've lost 244 seats. Mm-hmm. This is pretty dramatic. I mean, they've lost more seats than I think almost any other conservative government in history has in a consecutive election. This is an absolute defeat for the Conservative Party. They're entering an identity crisis. That's for certain. Right below them, we can see this other party, LD. Those are the Liberal Democrats. They're sort of a funny, interesting little party because their first part of their name, Liberal, the Liberal Party of the UK used to be one of the major parties. The Conservatives and the Liberals, that was the main political dichotomy up until about the First World War in the UK. But with the rise of the Labour Party in the UK, they started losing power. They were kind of in the political wilderness for a while. They rebranded as the Liberal Democrats sometime, I believe, in the 80s or 90s. And they've kind of tried to rise as a third party. They're sort of in between Labour and the Conservatives, but because of the reforms that mainstream Labour has done, in some ways the Liberal Democrats have left positions to Labour. And maybe I'll go into some of that a little bit more before too long. Right below that is SNP, the Scottish National Party. Their big thing was Scottish independence. For now, that force has pretty much died out. They weren't able to successfully rebrand into some other concern, so they're done. And then right below, you have the minor parties. Of note is Reform, which looks pretty small, +5. But if we were to look, and this is something, could you go to that second slide that you had prepared?
Oh, yeah.
This is something that is very prominent about what the seat result means versus the actual percentage of the popular vote, right? So the UK, much like the US, in fact, the UK is the inspiration for the US, has the first past the post system, right, in elections. What this means is whoever gets the most votes in a constituency, right, in a place where there's a representative going to be sent off, right, there's only one person sent, and it's whoever gets the most votes, right? Doesn't have to be a majority or anything like that. It's not proportional to the area. It's just you live in a constituency, and there's a lot of trouble over how these are districted. And whoever gets the most votes wins. This leads to a lot of strategic voting, et cetera, et cetera. And it leads to a lot of disparities in the national representative vote. So if you were to just look at the total share, we can see that on this chart right here, the red line is Labor, all right?
The red, you're right. Red line is Labor.
Yeah, the red line is Labor. And so Labor, it starts in the 1970s. It started to go down. There was the era of sort of neoliberalism, conservatism that saw its fall. You had the New Labor movement, which started around that rise we see around 1985, 1990, that coincides with Tony Blair's government, where they moved away from left policies. They removed a clause where they said that they wanted to create common ownership. They incorporated much more market logic into their ideology, right? So they were popular for a while. Then they started losing popularity again. They saw a small spike, and then they've gone down. Now, the interesting thing about how we see them going down is if we were to compare this to a chart over the years of their seat share, right, at this very last part between 2020 and 2025, we would see a dramatic rise. But on this chart, where we're looking at percentage of the actual national vote, we see actually that it's part of a trend of decline. Why and how is this the case? Well, the Labour Party had a strategy which allowed it both through collaboration with parties like the Liberal Democrats and just through sheer shrewdness of advertising and such, they mobilized in key areas where even though their national vote percentage fell, they won in enough constituencies where the Conservatives lost a significant amount. There was a power vacuum created, right? And Labor was the last man standing in many ways, right? So it holds a large amount of the seats, but it has not captured a large amount of the allegiance of the national electorate, right? So as we can see on the chart, Labor right about now is at 20%. The Tories, Conservatives, they're right about 15%. The next force up, and this is a point I was going to make earlier, is Reform. Reform UK, which is kind of this new rising, the Nigel Farage kind of a descendant of UKIP, UK Independence Party, and they're this Euro skeptic, UK nationalist, sort of far right, not necessarily explicitly far right, but definitely to the right of the Conservatives. They were done the most wrong by the first past the post system, which is funny because their name Reform UK partially comes in because they want to reform the electoral system because it unfairly hurts third parties, right? The first and second party tend to benefit the most in the first past the post system. But they received close to 10% of the total national vote, but they received a minuscule amount of actual parliamentary representation, right? What this is going to mean is they're going to be a constant pressure group overall. Labor is not going to want to call an election because in the UK, elections happen every so often, but they can also be called earlier due to a vote of no confidence, right? You usually need enough of your own party to not believe in you anymore as a leader for a vote of no confidence to go through. But they're probably going to want to delay, which is what the Conservatives did. It's how they were in power for so long. They had lost, their polling had been bad for many years, but they still held power because they were able to stop the election until now, right? Labor is likely to do the same thing because you have this national force set up in Reform, this new right organization that's rising, that's ready to take up that power vacuum that the fall of the Conservatives has created. And they're hungry and they're waiting for more and they feel as if they were owed more, right? And we may see some Conservative members of Parliament in the following years go rogue and affiliate with Reform. That's also another political possibility in parliamentary systems like that of the UK. A Conservative MP could say, you know what, I'm changing my affiliation. I'm now going to be Reform, right? My prediction, right, maybe if somebody wants to make a bet on it, I don't know if there are any betting organizations. There might be, God, it's so prevalent. My bet would be that there's probably going to be some Conservative MPs that switch over to Reform. But generally, I would say that the message being sent here is that we have sort of a mirage of a government. Labor has a license to do what it has, but the public is very obviously skeptical. If we return really quickly to the chart, the largest line is the gray line, right? This gray line, what does it represent? DNV, did not vote, all right? The majority of people, or close to the majority of people, we would say the largest group, the plurality of people, right, are not voting. They do not believe that the system is benefiting them. They do not believe that their vote is going to mean anything that they would actually approve of in their lives, right? Or for whatever reason, they're not voting. They're eligible to vote and they're not voting. That is the only number which has increased in the period, significantly increased in the period of 2020 and 2025, and it is the number one political force. So if any political party, such as Reform or such as some other party, were able to mobilize this large amount of people that are not involved, they could easily swing the control of the UK government in another direction. So I think any Labour government is going to be keenly aware of the fact that its support is skin deep. And there are also a lot of ideological divides within Labour. There's the New Labour, which is pretty much centrist. They're not really leftist at all. And then there's other factions that are varying degrees of more leftist. supporters of Jeremy Corbyn still in the party, even though he himself is no longer in the party. He won his election. He's an independent MP right now. So Labor is going to have a chance to prove its place in power, but I think it's going to move very cautiously, and I doubt that there's going to be a lot of actual change in the short term. That's going to come parliamentarily, right? Extra parliamentarily, perhaps, and most likely, there's going to be a lot of things that are going to happen in the UK and in other countries. But I think what we see is a setup for a tepid attempt at establishing a new political order. Thanks for attending my TED Talk.
And so, yeah, I run into the same, analysis, I guess, of, again, the Labour Party is not winning because people are excited about the Labour Party. They actually, like you said, you pointed out, they received less votes, right, than in 2019 by I think it was 4 million less votes out of 13 million, I believe, something before. Mm-hmm. And then, but the Conservative Party just collapsed, right? They got half the votes they got last time. And so again, much of these seats that the Labour has been able to get come from the collapse of the Conservative Party, not because of their own merits. Let's be clear about that. And I also think that the fact that people are not voting is a great thing. I mean, it potentially, right? Because that shows me. Because again, this is on the media. This is being sold as a leftist win, right? And what does that mean? Tony Blair, right? Tony Blair, Bill Clinton, they're the fucking builders of these last 25 years, right? That we've discussed in the noosphere. They were the ones who set these gears in motion to the shit that we have now. And so he will claim to be Labor, but I also want to bring people back to that episode with Jeff, where we talked about left of what? What is the left? Where does that come from? And this idea that somehow that this is a radical moment. It's not. This is part of a bourgeois system of democracy, or what they call democracy. And again, we can get into that. What does that mean? But I just want to bring attention to that fact that, right, it's not the merits of the left. I think that most people, like you said, are becoming more and more disenchanted. I see that here too, with this political process, or at least, realizing that it doesn't fucking matter, what you do, because the current goes the same way anyway. And so that's what I read from these results, from the fact that people are voting less, and the dwindling numbers. That in itself, I think, would be a cause of concern for the ruling class, because I think if you are caught in this idea that this matters, right, this voting and the electoral cycle matters and makes a difference, or you can at least hold off a wave of something bad, right? That notion is becoming less entrenched in the masses, where I think that's the reason people voted for Biden, right? And we'll get to that. It wasn't that they were excited for Biden. It was about stopping the evil, the fascists, the right-wing Trump, right? And so again, but this is what I take out of the UK elections, that the possibilities from something actually more radical, that actually has a potential to, in a revolutionary way, in a fundamental way, change something. It's there. It doesn't have a shape or a form necessarily, because all these parties are trying to capture, right, different people. These are different traps, these are different types of cheeses on the rat trap in order to bring into the system. That's how I see it. But again, I only call it a potential for something to change, because it's not inevitable. It takes work. It takes clarity of purpose in order to get something done with that energy that is falling off this apparatus.
Yeah, the reason that What's Left in part came to existence is because broadly the left in the United States would look at the elections in Mexico that came up and said that's a victory for the left. They would look at the elections in Britain and say that's a victory for the left. And they would look at the elections in France, which we will talk about, and say that's a victory for the left. There is no victory for the left. All of these, and I will start with this one, are a victory for the establishment and power as they repaint the house from red to blue or blue to red or whatever colors you might associate with Labor versus the Conservative Party. It is clear that there is utter disgust with what has been a rotating door of these prime ministers that have been placed up there. Richie Sunak, only the recent. Then there was that woman before that. And then there was some other clown. Boris Johnson came before that, right? And I think if there's any hope, like I agree with Kenny, if there's any glimmer of hope in the election results, it's in that group of people who did not vote. If one wanted to look at elections to try to understand what's actually happening in a country. But the clearest way to know that nothing changed is the fact that the first thing that Keir Starmer did once he was appointed or put in there into that position as, what's the position he holds? It's a prime minister?
Yeah, prime minister.
Prime minister is he went immediately to Ukraine and signed a 100-year deal, basically saying we're with you for the next 100 years. And understand this, that the reason all these people are so unhappy with their governments in Europe is not so much, I mean, there is people's anger with NATO being driven into this war, but is with the economic consequences of Europe hitching its wagon to the fortunes of the United States by agreeing to this war, to the war that the U.S. has set himself up on a path on with NATO, and by the Labour Party candidate committing to a 100-year support of Ukraine, they are committing to driving Europe into the ground economically, and I would say militarily, as a result of what will be a disaster, an oncoming disaster, because we're in World War III. And the first region, which is going to likely light itself up with nuclear bombs, is going to be probably Europe, if not the Middle East. So, and that's not the reason people are voting for it. I think the economy and things like that are the reasons. But the economy in those countries is going to be driven by the logic of World War III that we are in right now. And all these candidates, well, Keir Starmer has signed on for it big time, even more so, as much so than the previous candidates. So this assures that with all this talk of change, there is absolutely no change. And if there's any left in Britain which is celebrating this, I can tell you that is not a revolutionary left. That is a decidedly centrist left. That's the best I can call it. I think the possibility of revolution is going to rest with those people who are done with electoral politics altogether.
And just to make clear too, that they're a left within the capitalist system. They're not a left to the capitalist system.
Yeah, I that's something that I was definitely trying to allude to when I was, kind of talking about the development of labor with, new labor and all of that. There was a time when labor was technically socialist, right? Even though there was arguments for them moving away from socialism a long time before, they had parts in their own governing laws that outlined them as trying to advocate for common ownership of property, and this was all removed, And like I said, even though there are perhaps some elements within the party that attempt to reinstate that and push it further, this is where I think, I would say that the UK, like the US, I think if you're going to try to cause a better change, you shouldn't do so by working with an already established political force, because I think they're all pretty poisoned. Labour is very much implicated in the UK's still existing colonial policies, still existing imperial policies, right? And commercial policies, right? Labour just wants to make UK enterprise a nicer, safer version of whatever, but they still, their goal is profit. Their goal is not people, and security for people. So yeah, I think that's definitely the main thing that has to be looked at with all of these elections is any force that's trying to call itself the left. And I think there are varying degrees to how left each of these forces are. I would put labor at probably at around the same level as the Democrats. I would say there's a bigger variance. Labor contains both people that are even more conservative than many Democrats, and maybe also some people that are more generally leftist due to just being European than American Democrats might have, right? But they're roughly similar positions ideologically, I would say. Put and this is where I'm definitely interested to hear what y'all would have to say about this. I think when we move to France, the left-wing coalition that exists there, if you were to look at things on this sort of a chart kind of perspective, you might put the Popular Front that exists there on a more, ideologically, technically more left tilt than Labor or the Democrats in the U.S. Right?
And let's go to France because I think I'm going to end up saying the same thing about them, even though politically they actually represent a more radical. They will sound more radical, but I'm going to say essentially the same thing's going on. Do you want to see anything to say anything about this?
Let's just look at those charts really quick that you prepared for France.
All right, let's see.
Just I did a quick search on the economic growth. It depends on what you make of it. Of the UK in 2023, their growth was 0.01. It was less than 1%, and so just to the point that you were making about the economy, right? And sure, like the economic growth doesn't really paint a clear picture, but it gives you a hint as to what's going on in the UK and why people might be voting the way they are right now or not voting.
Yeah, and I do think the orientation of the British working class to the war in Ukraine and their continued involvement in that is going to be a very decisive factor in figuring out where things go. I will say that the Reform Party, it's Nigel Farage Reform Party, right? So they take positions that are anti-immigration, right? Like people very similar to what we hear from really Republicans and Democrats here, and which I don't agree with. But they also have taken a position very much like we don't want to be part of the European Union and we want out of this Ukraine war, and even questioning, I think, Britain's level of involvement in NATO. And I think their support they have for that. So there is obviously a section of the British working class that is tired of this, not just tired, don't want to be in this war, and are concerned about like the things that are taking place with now that you have everyone is now being signed up. It's not that everyone's in the military, but they started a process in Britain where everyone, like what's that called? It's
like
not
a registry?
Registration, yeah, where everyone's now being registered for potentially to be conscripted potentially. So they're starting a universal conscription process that they liken to Sweden's. When they started, they don't even mention anything about the war in Ukraine, but it is clear when you listen to British military people and the U.S. and the British ruling class that they are planning on. They need to increase the military to prepare for a war with Russia.
And I just think this is going to factor into other elections. But during his first speech in the House of Commons, this guy Stremer, right? He again talked about this being the most diverse, group of members that the UK has ever existed, right? And because I suspect too, these are also some ideas that are also being rejected by the common people, at large, the people that are being shoved down with these, ideas of inclusivity and all this stuff, because there is I think, a response to that is similar in many places, and we'll see it a bit in France, we'll see it in the U.S. But I just find that very interesting that in his first speech, he's alluding to this diversity, right? And as if that is what's going to bring social change to society,
So let's go to France. I've never really been in France, but let's go.
All right. So what we have here are not necessarily parties, but coalitions for the most part, right? In France, it's gotten to the point where you need a coalition so bad that your coalition is becoming a little bit more like being a party, right? We may in the near future see the elimination of many of these old political parties, and they may consolidate into these alliances more formally. But for now, they do exist as coalitions, especially the New Popular Front, right? So this was the plurality, right? So they gained the most seats, the plurality coalition within the French election. It was a parliamentary election, right? It was not a presidential election. There was no leadership changing, but it contains many different political parties within it, right? Some people may be familiar with Jean-Luc Mélenchon, who was the presidential candidate last cycle around. His party, Le France Insoumise, is a part of this New Popular Front. Alongside them is also a traditional French left party, the Parti Socialiste, the French Socialist Party. And even, for example, groups like, the Ecological Greens, right? The Green Left, and even our old friends, the Parti Communiste Français, right, the Communist Party of France, they are technically in this coalition, right? And so this is where I think this is what part of what Andy and I were uh, alluding to when it comes to saying there's potentially a more radical tilt to this version of the center left, right? They technically contain groups like the French Communist Party that are explicitly anti-capitalist, supposedly, right? Um, they contain these groups like Le France Insoumise, which, even though it's not necessarily a communist or socialist party, it has been called a very left populist kind of radical party in that way in terms of the energy of it, right? There's been a lot of kind of neoliberal fear propaganda spread, around there about them. But regardless, it is still this collection of a moderating force. And they're probably going to have to work with Ensemble, um, which is the sort of center
and just to say,
liberal
they have
coalition.
already been working with Ensemble to get to this point. That's the whole
There's
point.
strategic voting, right? And now it's an informal alliance up until now. Ensemble are the centrists, right? The current president of France, oh God, I'm forgetting his name right now. Macron, right? If that's him, right? So they are liberals, centrists, pro EU to the max, right? They're just they're the center. The UK doesn't exactly have a center in the way that the France has a center. Labor does kind of occupy that force, but ideologically, you might say that the Liberal Democrats are closer to Ensemble in the UK. So they have gone from being the leading political force in France to being the second political force. They are no longer going to be the head of any government. So even if they do make an agreement with the Popular Front, they're going to have to be junior partners, right? Which is why they may not end up making an agreement. It's possible to try to do what's called minority government, right? Where you rule without confidence, and any legislation that you manage to pass is going to be through a lot of negotiation rather than the guarantees that come with a coalition government, right? Below that, you have the National Rally. And so, Andrew, you had made a quick little mention. You said, well, that's just Le Pen. And I think I mostly agree with you. It is really united behind that family. In fact, I sometimes call it the National Front, because that was its old name, right? Whenever I was first getting into French politics, that's what it was called at that time. They've always had this further right connotation. The center right was the Republicans, right? So you see that fourth light blue bar right there. That was like Sarkozy, right? Nicolas Sarkozy. I don't know, if anyone remembers that, kind of towards the end of the 2000s. Kind of a counterpart to George Bush in certain ways. That was the right, sort of like, those are your Tories, right? So you here in France, you see kind of a nightmare scenario for the Conservative Party, right? Because the French version of the Conservative Party, they've already definitely become the fourth political force, not even the third political force, right? Because the analog to the Reform UK in France is much more powerful, right? The National Rally, those are seat counts, right? So where in the UK, they have a first past the post system, and so the right in the UK was stifled. In France, they have proportional representation according to party lists. So because the far right is gaining a lot of support in France, a lot of popular support in France, they have gained a lot of seats. And so you see them as a definitive force of the right. They're carrying the banner right now. So you might be able to say, and there's also a lot of other parties as well, as you can see with that gray.
Should I stay with this thing now? Or?
Yeah, we can go away now. We can go away. I would say in France, so whereas in Britain, you have another side of the center kind of getting, trying to hold the baton and keep going. In France, you see the collapse of the center. The left is kind of merging with the center, though, I will say, more definitively in France. But there is more of a radicalization on the right. The political right in France is much more empowered than the political right in the UK is as of right now. I will say that. Where I will say that in both cases, it's not a true left victory for either the UK or for France. I would say in France, the right definitely shares in the victory. It has grown the most of any other party. During the successive rounds, because there's a multi-round system in France, people have a chance to vote again after the smallest parties are eliminated. So there's a lot of strategic voting that happens. The far right party was the only party to increase its vote share in both rounds, right? So it increased during the first round, just like the Popular Front did, but the Popular Front actually decreased somewhat during the second round. And the far right was able to keep increasing its technical percentage. It just ended up as the third force as of right now. But they're much more established. And I think the right in France, I mean, politics in France have always been a little more likely to go into a non-legal way, let's say, whether that's through violence or other acts that are done on the street or not in the legislature. I think politics in France have always had, compared to especially the UK, they've always had that volatility. And I think we do see that. That's, I think, a difference that I'd highlight between the UK and France, and then therefore between France and the United States. Their political environment is a little more volatile in technical ideological terms. And we're seeing more of a radicalization on a more apparent level. But I would say generally, France has over time exhibited that more than the UK or the US have.
Just, I guess, one thing, I don't know if you mentioned it, but I think it's worth stating that the Macron ensemble and the New Popular Front kind of came into an agreement in order to prevent Marine Le Pen from winning. So this the what they call the right wing, the far right, in the media. And so that was the reason they came together, even though they're not going to come together to form a majority government, right? And so you are in this quote unquote quagmire that, where there is no majority rule. But again, they just came together to prevent the right wing from reaching a majority.
Yeah, I mean, so first, the thing that I would say is that in the first round, the majority victory in that first round was what's Le Pen's called?
The National Rally.
The National Rally. That's what the party's called? Okay.
Yeah,
so
Rally National.
Okay. So in the first round of this vote, and that everyone was like, "Oh my God, look at the far right is winning." And by the far right, we pretty much mean the same things we mean by the Reform Party: anti-immigrant, get out of European Union, and a criticism of France's involvement in NATO and with the U.S. war in Ukraine. Although I haven't heard that criticism said as clearly from Le Pen as I've heard it from Farage. So there, I'm less sure that they represent.
I guess, yeah, I will make this. From what I was reading, The right in France is just trying to make sure that France always gets the better part of the deal in the EU. Very few people are advocating for France to leave the EU because they rightfully understand that France is one of the hegemons of the EU alongside Germany. So, the right in France is mostly like France first, then Europe is the way they see it.
Then maybe I haven't heard that from Le Pen because they're not saying it as much, or maybe they don't even speak to that. But they would certainly speak of French national like autonomy of some level, So they were the big winners of 2 weeks ago, and then the second one was the Popular Front, and then third was Macron's party, and it looked like a wipeout. And people were saying Macron's strategy of calling an early elections was a failure. Well, what you see now is why why France has this two-step vote. Alexander Mercouris, who is from the Duran, was basically saying their whole reason for this system has been historically to keep the far left down. Because after you get that first vote, if it looks like the communists are coming to power, you can make these deals between the right and the center to wipe them out. And this is now essentially what has happened here is the far left has made a deal with the center to keep what they call the far right out of power. But let's be clear, like this is basically Macron's going to still be the president. One of his guys said he wanted to step down as the parliament person or something like that, and Macron said, no, you're going to stay there. To me, this is people who, if you read their newspapers, you would think these are revolutionaries when we talk about the Popular Front, because there's anarchist groups in there. There are probably groups like that I used to be part of, like ISO, smaller little Trotskyist groups or anarchist groups or Maoist groups, being all part of this Frankenstein monster of the far left. But essentially what we've done is we've sold our entire souls to keeping the center afloat. And in doing that, we're the ones who are going to have to keep the center afloat in order to keep the far right from power. It's the same deal you've always heard in US politics. What about the fascists? What about Trump's a fascist? Reagan's a fascist. That's why the far left always has to sell out itself to go to the center. And that's what's happening here again. And they've done it big time here, because if there's any positions that the new Popular Front is critical of the current regime, it's all Macron's stuff of like Macron's changing the pension system, a lot of the economic things he's done that they're saying they're going to undo. They're going to absolutely undo none of that. Like they can't do it because they've formed an alliance with them to keep themselves to keep Macron essentially in power, and will keep that system in power. And lastly, while the Popular Front says, "Oh, we've got to make statements about ending the war in Gaza," they are entirely clear that you must defend Ukraine. That the Popular Front party is entirely clear about saying Ukraine must be defended, Russia must be defeated. So they are foursquare for the war in Ukraine. And because of that, there is absolutely no possibility that they can play any role in changing anything. They are going to help France and the French working class go to war. And also they're going to see their living standards decline because the war is going to be the reason for that. And so this I think is a bigger fraud than what you even see in Europe. I mean, in Britain, to me, because they're not going to do anything to challenge Macron because they've already united with Macron's party in order to keep Le Pen and the National Rally out.
I guess I had more of a question. I wonder how much, what's happening in Africa too, right? Like where France is being kicked out and, in being replaced by Russian forces or other alliances in the Sahel region between states to, kind of become independent economically from France, and the French financial system. And so I wonder how much of this also plays into what's happening over there. But I guess it's more rhetorical.
Funnily, the first thing that actually comes to my mind is kind of an obscure fact. That fourth political force that I talked about, the old center right, the Republicans, it had been their foreign policy to actually somewhat be allied with Russia. This was way, this is like 10, 15, 20 years ago. But I remember there was this big thing about France selling Russia an aircraft carrier, right? They were aligned. There's been kind of a historical hot and cold relationship between many different French and Russian governments, going all the way back to the time of the French kingdom and the Russian Empire, right? So I do have to say there's always been kind of a dance between France and Russia. So it's definitely being played out in Africa. We see it's another version. It's become definitely more of a proxy war. Like I said, the conservatives tried to align with Putin and with Russia. They tried to get them on their good side, pretty much. They tried to somehow cooperate and collaborate. I think if they had been in power around the time that Crimea was happening, they would probably try to say, "Oh, let the referendum happen and let Russia have it," you know. But their fall had already started much before that. You know, the pro-Europe kind of full send neoliberal forces that are the ones that have been really encouraging the full total like protection of Ukraine. They were already starting to be in power because Skorzeny and all that. They had lost a lot of legitimacy because of their involvement in the Iraq War and things like that, right? So yeah, just I know that's a lot of other random thoughts, but I do think France's position in Africa is always in contention, and how that relates to Russia is it's obvious that they're no longer seeking to have any kind of friendly policy with Russia. Like the French voting public has been convinced of the fact that Russia is no friend to it. I think that's definitely the. I think a lot of it also has to do with the fact that they were legitimately both scared by Russian threats of severing natural gas lines to Europe, and also egotistically feeling as if they could somehow make up for that loss, and as if they didn't need Russia, right? So I do think it's obvious that I think nationally, as of right now, much like during the First World War, I do have to say the French people and the French governmental forces seem to be focused in on supporting the war in Ukraine.
The funny thing is that this whole energy independence and stability, like a nightmare scenario was brought on by the U.S. itself. And one of the reasons the European economies are struggling is because of the severance that the U.S. did one through the pipeline that they exploded, the one going into Germany. And so I know that energy prices are insane, and like it's affecting like industrial capacity and on and on and on. And there also increases their dependence on American gas. And so they're becoming more and more of a satellite of the U.S. Sphere of influence.
Yeah, and I would say that the results of this election show that Macron's party is in decline in the same way that you saw that with the Conservative Party in Britain. And I think it's connected very much to. I ultimately will say it's due to Europe's support of the war on Russia, and ultimately the war on China, and to do anything they need to do economically, the sanctions regime and things like that, and then of course supporting the fact that the United States is going to blow up the Nord Stream pipeline and eliminate the access of Europe to Russian oil as best they can. I will say that the New Popular Front did pretty well in both rounds. I would say. And I think the reasons are, looking at their positions, are because of their economic policies. Like they want to change. Reverse Emmanuel Macron's controversial changes to pensions, raise public sector wages, link salaries to inflation, and introduce a wealth tax for the rich, cut income tax and Social Security on low-wage people. They're talking about raising the minimum wage, a fund for 500,000 childcare places, cap the prices of essential foods, electricity. Those are all the things that they are running on, but they literally hitched their wagon to the very party that is committed to cutting those things. So there's no way those things they're going to arrive at those things. So they've already essentially I don't know if they're fooling themselves, but they've already told a deep lie to the electorate that once again revolutionaries are lying to workers in their face, and that hurts the cause of revolution.
And I also think there is something to be said about those promises, right, within the capitalist system. Especially the West, which is highly indebted, and so again, I think that in itself is another level of fraud that is constant among left parties that promise all these, reforms, right, to the state in order to make life more bearable. And when they actually come into power, they don't deliver those things because they are attached to a capitalist system, in so many ways. And so that in itself it's a fraud that is has been going on in many countries, the Labor Party, the Democrats, on and on and on.
Yeah, this really goes back to the overall selling out of the cause of revolutionary socialism by the European left back during the First World War. I know that's my pet subject, but it's my pet subject for a reason. We live in the specter of that, right? While during Karl Marx's time, there may have been the specter of communism. In our time, we have the specter of the selling out of socialism, right? We know that all parties calling themselves socialists at some point endorsed the machine of the state, the machine of the market, the machine of oppression, right? They have continued it. They have tried to say that it was a necessary sacrifice. And this is where, I don't want to go too much into this discussion, but this is where I do wonder for those of us who try to be, true, right? Because that's also another, it's difficult even defining what true revolutionary is, but we try to be actual revolutionaries, right? To what point are we relentless? To what point do we try to create stages, right? How do we try to maneuver in this system where it's obvious that those people that most of the public would assume we're allied with, we're not, but we have to somehow get popular support, right? This always seems to be kind of a big question of like, how do you cross that veil from being grassroots into being more effective without selling your idea? Because it seems to be that this realistic moderation is kind of the death of a lot of idealistic notions that people have had over the years. And it happens with a lot of regularity. So I guess, again, I don't want to go too deep into it because I do want to start discussing other elections and then going on to the U.S. election. But I did kind of want to stop here since it's kind of coming up in what we've already discussed.
Yeah, but I do want to just add Latin America into this because that's a place where this is like the prime example of what I'm talking about too. What you're saying, these like so-called socialist countries, Nicaragua, Venezuela, Argentina, in its time, Brazil, Bolivia, Ecuador, Chile, right? Like they had leftists, whatever, but and then we end up in the same shit and then some, and then worse. Actually, the working class itself gets in an even worse situation, right? Because of these so-called like people trying to navigate that challenge, right? Like that radical change, and that actually delivers to the working people in what we're seeing right here, right? Like, so I just bring that up. At some point, we might get into that, not in this episode, but I just think Latin America is in the prime example, and it's also a prime example of that swing, right left swing, that's been happening. The same period that we kind of been mentioning in the last few episodes, the 2000 to 2020 to now.
I think that is the conversation we should have because, first of all of us are self-described revolutionaries, and I think people have illusion. Everyone knows that the left in the United States is screwed, but people have illusions in the European left and they have illusions in the South American left. And I think they've been destroyed. One of the ways they've been destroyed is by this same net mechanism of thinking there's a get rich quick scheme that they can use to propel, to push their ideas to the top. There's other ways that they get this wrong, but one of the ways they get, in my opinion, they get this wrong is thinking there's an electoral path towards pushing their ideas out. And that electoral path, whether it's national or local, I'm going to say, if any revolutionary group at this point, given the way the bourgeois elections work, it looks to me, any revolutionary group that tries to use that electoral path, whether it be, like I said, a national candidate, a statewide or local candidate, I believe is heading themselves on the path right down towards reformism, like immediately, like not like in a week, but the day they choose that path, they are stepping off of the grassroots commitment to building revolution from below and starting them on a path that is what I would associate with state instituted revolution, state power revolution, the kinds of things where you're going to have to institute your revolution from above and impose it on people for as well-meaning as you want. And there is no future in that. I mean, that's the best you'll get, frankly. But really what you'll get is basically people selling themselves out step by step to draw people back into the capitalist system that what we are trying to do is tell people, no, this system is a lie. The system doesn't work. You have to get out of it. And we have to build our own and make that system the system we run by and be prepared to defend it if it comes to that. And so I believe the lesson out of this is that the reason that What's Left forms here for us, like why we have a What's Left podcast, apparently it's needed in South America and it's needed in Europe, because apparently these lefts are deeply confused and deeply caught up in a trap that the capitalists have set for them, and they fall into each time. So there are many ways that you can get revolution wrong. So this is not just one, but I believe that the lesson from looking at this should be, number one, that the left around the globe is screwed everywhere. And number two, one of the ways you can know it is the degree to which they found their hand trapped inside of the illusion of mass growth through involvement in the electoral system, when in fact, they don't change the system by being involved in the electoral system, they get changed. And that's what it's there for. The electoral system is there to work on the heads of people, and it has that effect on the on revolutionaries today. There's a way that in the Russian Revolution that the Bolsheviks did try to use it a little differently, and there are some things that maybe I could imagine, but at this point right now, I would say stay out of it altogether and forever. And so that's for me the big lesson out of this.
Yeah. I think I definitely agree. I guess it's just part of the fear for me is knowing that the journey is a lonely one anyway. And there is, just because I guess I want to be vulnerable in a way right now, like there is, to me, like this, as radical as it's very easy for me to be on an ideological level, I have to acknowledge this, like, I don't want to die for something that's not going to happen, and that's always like, that's the great fear. And if we are going to be revolutionaries, I don't think we get there by just ignoring that. We need a strong response to that, because everyone is going to feel that to some extent, I think, that being said, I say the reason I continue to be a revolutionary is because we're still dying, and it's definitely not for the things that we believe in. That's what I would say. Obviously it hasn't worked. I have felt for a long time, any political organization which is calling itself leftist, but which is currently attempting to collaborate with state through elections, is poisoned. We need new organizations. If anyone that is a member of those organizations wants to argue that they're still useful, they need to do so by making a significant step and stepping away from their power structure and entering the same way everybody else did, right? And without the advantages of their previous post, right? And actually with suspicion. It has to be harder for them because anyone that's already connected, I think this has just been my feeling for a long time. You're suspect because what has the mainstream done to us, right? Those of us that have dreamed of more serious social revolution, because this to me is the question. It's a question of a reformation of society itself, right? A revolution, a true revolution would be an actual change in the very basic way our day-to-day life is led, right? In the way we understand concepts itself, right? And the people that have tried to moderate us, that are so-called our friends, that are so-called our closest allies, they've led to our deaths. They've led to their own deaths, stupidly enough, in many cases, right? Many times, like in Germany, you had this center-left that was convinced that as long as it was in the seat of power, it could keep that seat of power. And that was not the case because it was already, it's like the journey for the One Ring, if anyone knows Lord of the Rings, right? It was sort of Gollumized, right? They're like, oh, once they didn't have the ring, they'd sort of withered away, and look what happened to them in comparison. They used to have it. That was theirs. They were able, for a moment they said, oh, we're in charge. We're calling the shots. Let's take it easy. Hey, don't go so. Hey, all of you radicals, you need to relax. We're gonna get what we want. Just you better do it on our terms. You don't want to do it with us? Hey, I'm gonna sick the people that have always wanted to kill us on you, and then I'm gonna expect that they're not gonna go against me. It's hard to believe, but it's easy to see. This has happened historically, and it's gonna happen again. And I think, Andrew, when you say the left is screwed, this sounds very negative, and I think it's something, my response to that is I think we just have to accept that we're screwed and then see what's on the next page. I don't want to be a defeatist, and I don't think that's necessarily a defeatist position to have. I am the type of person that believes that even after a collapse, if you have some scrap to work with, it can be turned just into something very useful, something very good. And that is essentially what I think the strategy that I want to engage in, during this electoral season, is just challenge people's belief in the electoral system and to create dual power structures, because that's what the Bolsheviks were able to do, and that's what, for example, like the anarchists in Spain, they were able to create real existing structures, right? It wasn't just that they had a political strategy they were trying to advocate. They had village communes, they had really existing people's malicious organizations, right? The Bolsheviks were able to do the same thing, and even more than the Bolsheviks, right? Those other parties that in many ways the Bolsheviks betrayed, like the left SRs, things like that, they had legitimate dual power organizations, right? The Soviets, the reason they're called the Soviets, Soviet means council, right? That's what we need to do. Like, I think that hasn't changed, in many ways. Like, while I think a lot has to change, I also think that's one thing where it's like, no, we just have to do that again and for real. Because the mistake the people made, like the mistake the leadership made, and this was even the mistake the Bolsheviks made, was not giving all power to the councils, not giving all power to the people. They got on their wave by waving around that slogan, and they abandoned it as soon as it was no longer convenient for their ideological grip on power, right? So I think as long as we commit ourselves to legitimate people's control, like the local council is the be-all, end-all, right? Anything that's bigger than that needs to work on the explicit approval of the small unit. I think that's if it's not going to be top down anymore, then it really has to not be top down anymore. It has to be, the local is supreme. If we decide to secede, then you're going to have to negotiate with us, and we're going to have to negotiate with you because we're no longer working with the councils around us, right? And if there's going to be some larger organization, it's only going to continue to exist because all the localities continue to affirm to it, right? That has to be the rule. That to me, it's so clear, it's so obvious. It has to be all power to the Soviets, all power to the councils, all power to the people. Because as soon as we move away from that, and you're exactly right, the electoral process is a liberal trick, right? Because who came up with elections, right? The modern elections that we have, exist from essentially nobility that were kind of edgy and didn't want autocracy anymore, but they wanted to still continue their privileges in a new way, right? Because they were kind of the underside. They were the have-nots of the nobility, right? They decided, oh, we're going to have this liberal idea. We're going to do Freemasonry. We're going to spread this thing. We're going to have this whole, plan. But it wasn't the oppressed people. They used oppressed people as their tools, right? Another one of my big pets, the Mexican War of Independence. The people that ended up winning were Spaniards who had fought against Mexican independence until the very last moment. And the common people that had died every step of the way, any hint of ideological push of what they really wanted disappeared for decades and decades and decades in Mexico. And it still hasn't really appeared. It's only briefly made appearances through people like Zapata and his, children, right, that currently exist still in Chiapas, right? But so then that has to be our strategy. We have to be advocating for true local power to absolutely replace the so-called democratic representative system, because we want a true rulership by the people, not some abstracted form of certain people. Wherever you're at, the people in that area are the absolute determiners of what happens in that area. I think that has to be the condition.
I think it requires honesty when we fail, right? When we're tricked, and just to beat a dead horse, or not even, but the pandemic, we brought it up, and it's been one of the biggest attacks on working people of the world, and the biggest transfer of wealth in the history of humanity, and yet, there is many who haven't come to terms and analyze that period in the ways that we need to, in order to, carry out what you're saying, and having that North Star, within sight of, fucked the top down shit, we've seen it. It's been done. Like, history is full of that shit. And not to make this too long, but this is something that happened in the mission, where when the pandemic hit, different like grassroots shit sprung up, like people that I personally knew, and we knew that our people needed to be fed. And then we formed networks, that kind of organically, came together. But there was a period where, we didn't have the resources, right? And we did get some city resources, and and I've always said it, even when we get fucking donations from corporations, take their fucking money, don't shut up. Just, like, don't let them buy your silence. But the point is that there are moments where you hit crossroads, and that, what will mark a leap, and so we had a chance to take over spaces in the mission, to use them for our fucking projects that were, helping the community. We had the political capital of different people in the community who had a lot of, trust because of what they represented, and no one wanted to do shit. No one wanted to take over these spaces. No one wanted to risk their fucking neck. And I get it; it's scary, but this is the conversations we have to have about power, where power lies, in the cost of it, the reality of it, right? Like, the consequences. But I think we are going to have other chances, probably to take those steps. And I guess if anyone's listening, this is a clear example. Anyone listening that knows me, this was a clear chance. But what happened was that most organizations fell behind the state on imposing masks on people, on herding people to vaccines. And not only that, but adding insult to injury, after the pandemic was over in San Francisco, some of those same community organizations are forcing people to get vendor permits from the fucking streets of the mission. That's the radical, quote unquote, radical fucking local organizers that we're dealing with. And so we have to be honest about what has happened, what continues to happen, how power is related to all this shit. And this is why I love the collage of conversations that we have, because we talk about education, we talk about the medical system, and basically the totalitarian system that we live in, that is called capitalism. It encompasses all our fucking lives. You know, so fuck fascism, and you know, we're living in a totalitarian system that is just fucking getting its news ready because they have to. You know, but again, we are gonna have to be honest about the shit that we've done, that we have failed at, right? And there are historical examples, because this might seem as like a small shit in the mission, but that's where it starts. If we're talking about community power, we have to understand those dynamics, that if you want to take it to the realtors, to the fucking capitalists, you know, when you have the community support, when you have the righteous cause, you know, and we fucking failed miserably because we don't understand this, you know, and I don't blame it. Like, we've been miseducated, you know, about all this shit. You know, everyone who goes through the fucking system has very little sense. Like, the shit that you know, Alex, is mostly from outside, not from inside, right? The same for me. Like, the shit that I learned wasn't in college or in fucking high school. It's talking to you guys and people who question shit, you know. So, but this is the conversation we're gonna need to have about these processes, you know, whether it's fucking elections or organizing in the community.
Yeah, and I think, Alex, you said something that really got my attention last episode when you mentioned that really World War I and World War II are just Act One and Act Two of one war that was resolved ultimately in World War II, and really led to the defeat of the working class. Because, and you talked about where all the action took place, not the body count per se, but the action was in World War I, and I very much agree with that. Although, of course, I know that you would say that the Spanish Revolution that took place on the eve of World War II is still a very meaningful example. When we look at this, we're talking about the action of the revolution that took place in Russia and the possibility of revolution in Germany. That's World War I, and where we're talking about two things, which built infrastructure from below, and ultimately through various ways, that infrastructure either got repressed or it got co-opted into something that was the reverse of what it was intending to be. But a similar story is really to be played out, at least in World War II, in terms of the reason, like I said earlier, that the French electoral system was in many ways designed to shut out the left. Why did it need to be designed that way? Because the left was hugely popular after World War II, because it was the socialists and communists that were part of the resistance to the Vichy government in France. Real resistance from below that hated the Nazis, hated the Vichy government. I think mistakenly understood, maybe allied themselves too much with the United States. Of course, if you're in part of the resistance, take your weapons from anybody you can. Take them from the U.S., take them from whatever, but do not believe that the U.S. is your ally in that process. To the extent that the communists and socialists at the time saw the U.S. as somebody to come in and help them in taking down the Vichy government, and they had to understand that no, whatever government's placed by the United States or by the Germans or by the French is taken down. We're putting up a workers' government here. Like, we're gonna establish something on a new basis. And so the massive popularity that the communists and socialists had at that time was very much connected to the role that they had played there. And the electoral system ultimately was used to just dissipate all of that to what we have today. And that's why I think, for me, the lesson is stay out of it at all costs. In the same way that somebody might say, Andy, you're a really good teacher. Maybe you should become a manager or a principal, and you can become even better for education. Anyone knows that is like, I have now crossed a threshold somewhere. I have now crossed a class threshold. And now I'm as good a worker as I might be, as much revolutionary as I want to be. I am now on the other side once I do that. And I kind of think the same thing happens once you get yourself involved in electoral politics, is that you cross a threshold. So that is my feeling about that. But I do say, and you're right, I think the word screwed is wrong. I'm just going to say that the left in Europe and the left in South America and the left in the United States are all globally, like, we're all equally weak. Maybe one's a little stronger than the other, but we're talking about really, we're all in places of really bad shape. But I do believe we're in World War III. I do believe World War III is going to present, in the same way that World War I and World War II did, under pretty desperate situations, present new opportunities of building something from below. And that is something else that emerges out of these world wars, is the possibility of something new. And so I do actually think that time is coming again. But I'd like to avoid the same mistakes that the mistakes we always make.
Yeah, I want to highlight as well the fact that, so yeah, this left coalition in France is called the New Popular Front, right? And to your point about electoral politics being a corrupter, especially in France, so this Popular Front, it's called the New Popular Front because it takes its name from the Popular Front that existed in between the First and Second World Wars, and so that Popular Front was, yeah, most of the left uniting to say we're going to stop the rise of the right, because at that time the French right was rising a lot in conjunction with the Nazis. They were almost in agreement with the Nazis. Even though obviously the French and German visions of nationhood are in conflict, they were kind of trying to just be like, oh, we all got screwed by these liberal powers. We're going to find some way of achieving national greatness, or whatever those fascists were saying at the time. But that group represented a meeting of groups which had all in one way or another portrayed the revolution, right? So you go to, at that time, what the Socialist Party was called was the French section of the Workers' International, right? So they consider themselves the French section, right? But that party was the party that had created the Sacred Union in France during the First World War to give support to the national war effort, right? So they're already totally poisoned, right? And then even the communists, who were technically, they had this like, oh, let's actually overthrow the system. By this point, they were Stalinists, right? So they were the people that several months prior had been preaching never the Popular Front. And as soon as the tune changed from Moscow, they started saying, yeah, all power to the Popular Front. We have to, elections are the best, guys, So they showed their own hand there, right? And these are pretty much the same parties. So really, if you pay even just a little more attention to the available history, the message becomes clear. These are the same puppets from before. Like the strings go all the way back. They've renamed themselves multiple times. But if you were, this is always a fun activity. I know Wikipedia isn't the best source for information, but something I like to do is I go to a political party's page, and I just keep going back to what they were. Because a lot of times you'll see merged from or came from, there'll be some section where it's like what it used to be, right? I always play this little game where I'm like, okay, let's see. Where did it come from? When you play that game in France, man, it starts looking scary for anyone that wants to support any mainstream party there. Because those were the French political parties. They were the main instigators for this whole Sacred Union thing. They were the betrayers of the revolution, more than even the British, right? More than the Germans, even in some ways, because at least the German Social Democrats showed much more apprehension towards the war. Of course, they're the ones that ended up losing, but it didn't look like that the whole time. But their party was more visibly divided than the French Socialist Party was about the war, right? So those are the people that are trying to say we are the left, we're the Popular Front, right? These are not our friends, right? We have to be adamant. As much as I do believe in this idea of left unity when it comes to like socialists, anarchists, communists, the different flavors of revolutionary leftism, I think we need to make a clear separation from the electoralists, from the social democrats, from the moderates, from all of those forces, because any supposedly communist or socialist party or anarchist group which works with these forces has already it's a poisoned well. It's so like, I don't know, maybe it's just because I've spent so much time reading about these histories. I have a book on the history of the development of the French Socialist Party and how it went into this history of moderation, right? But it's just, to me, this history is so significant. Whenever you take this path of moderation, whenever you take this path of mainstream acceptance, it's actually, the fact is, yeah, you're going to get changed by it. The mainstream can be changed. That's the whole idea of revolution. It's not this fixed thing. Tradition is not the inherent truth of life, because whether or not we like it, as much as we like to talk about how revolution has failed, the traditionalist vision has also failed, right? Things have changed. Society continues to change regardless, right? So for those of us that want revolution, we just have to remember things are not as static as they appear to be. But we have to know how to legitimately take advantage of situations and not get taken advantage by them.
I mean, I will say this about this in that, like, the connection. It is interesting that we're not talking about rigged elections here. We're not talking about, the narratives and, like, to some degree we're conceding some authenticity to these numbers, right? And, compared to, I think, we might say about the US. So just wanted to throw that out there, that
Well, I think
important.
there are people in both France and Britain who would say that there's rigging going on, and I think there probably is. I don't think it matters. I don't think it needs. I don't. Regardless of the degree to which things are rigged or not, what these numbers themselves tell you all you need to know about what's taking place and the political positions, and then the things that you see the politicians start to do. I'm not saying. I mean, I think for me, rigging is just another piece of evidence that we don't really live in a democracy. We live in a dictatorship. But also this discussion we're having, the fact that we're so locked in, we are so trapped in a capitalist system here, in reform system, and that really all we're saying is if you want revolution, then you may want to think twice before you step into that region. I'm saying don't do it at all. I think Alex, I can't. I think you're literally leaning in that direction. But if you are going to take on the powers of the state, you can't take them on through their electoral system.
And I would say that there's a lot of people who see issues, right, and they may not see the full picture. And, like, I would say that if you start with your issue, if you want really that issue to change, even just that, like, partial view, it's not going to change, and it is connected to more things than just that view, right? Like when we talked about the anti-vaxxers, for example, right? Like, or the people who resisted the COVID vaccines. Uh, there's a web of things that you begin to untangle once you dig in, and you realize that it leads to this question of revolutionary change, at least in my view. You know, in like, again, where you're saying, if you want that to change, if you want that radical or like fundamental change, which is what we call revolution, then we're talking about that.
Yeah, I mean, I would say my interest in understanding these elections, I mean, number one comes from this is personal. I mean, I'm just a nerd, and I like to, I kind of can't help but look at any piece of information that's put in front of me that I somehow have been trained to think is significant. So I'm not going to necessarily say that it's important to understand these elections. To attempt to back it up, I would say I do want to understand this machine. I don't want to nakedly oppose it, because I would rather, if I can bear to look at my opponent, then I rather would than not, right? Because in a fight, it's better to know how, why, and when your opponent moves. Obviously, we can get entrapped believing too much in the situation, as you're saying, Kenny. Like, it's not necessarily true that these are accurate reflections of votes, but I mostly take the view that, yeah, whether or not it's an actual reflection of the way every single vote was cast, it doesn't matter. It's the system telling you where it's at right now in some way. There is some truth to, because they have to, because here's my thing. If it is being rigged, the idea is that they're creating a narrative, right? It is sort of this, to go back to the idea of the noosphere, right? It's this idea war. And I would say it does exist more in people's heads. It's an attempt to create a reality that reinforces a soft power attempt to say, it's this interplay of like, well, okay, so we're doing this and it's going to justify this, because there needs to be some story to justify all the bullshit that happens, right? Because I think the days of powerful people just doing what they want without very much care, they're pretty much over. They're very concerned with trying to, now those days could be coming back, but the point that I'm making is, I do think that the people in power are very occupied with this kind of juggling act of trying to justify the story in order to keep people committed to the situation. And they are actually scared about people not participating, although they might be finding ways of turning that non-participation into still acquiescence, but regardless, I think it's important for us who are revolutionaries to try to see what we can parse from what they're telling us. Obviously we can't take it at face value, but I think we still have to look at it in order to try to peer deep, so.
And to go back to our last week's conversation, which was about hard power and soft power, I do see elections as soft power mechanisms of social control. And to preview, I think, our next week's discussion, one of the conclusions I'm drawing out of what's happening in our elections, U.S. elections, is I think it previews the fact that soft power way of control is eroding, which means that hard power mechanisms are increasingly going to have to come into being. So that's why I want to discuss it more though next week. But I definitely was glad to talk about UK and France, and Alex, to hear just you have a lot more detailed information and awareness of some of those things. So that was very helpful to go through. So I'm glad we could talk about it. So is that it?
I just think Eduardo would have liked to talk about other elections like Colombia.
No, Eduardo would have wanted to talk about the French elections.
Oh yeah,
he's big into that because he's been there a lot. So I think he's going to be sorry that he wasn't at least there for that, because I know he has a lot more information about theirs. But Eduardo, we're thinking about you, and hopefully you'll come back and you can talk to us about. I mean, this whole fiasco with Biden, it's going to as it plays out, there's a lot of things to say about what's going on. And a lot of it is speculative on all of our parts, but I would love to speculate with all of you about it. So that'll be it for this week. Thank you, Alex. Thank you, Kenny. What's Left is a weekly political podcast channel challenging the mainstream left. We post information about our topics and our guests on the episode notes, wherever you found this episode, or on our blog, what'sleftpodcast.com. You can find past episodes to this podcast channel there and connect with us. I remind you, if you like anything you've heard here, please subscribe, rate, review, turn on your notifications to any of our, I think, 8 platforms, Spotify, iTunes, Bitchute, Odysee, Rumble, YouTube, or Telegram. And if you'd like to give us feedback about something you've heard or suggest something for us to cover, contact us through our blog. So that's it for me, Andy, and for Alex and Kenny. That's it for What's Left, and we'll see you next week.